goddess of thunder, mistress of the cosmic element.
Hello and welcome back everyone. Today we're going somewhere extremely elemental because our next subject doesn't hide her mutation under fur or ruby glasses. She commands the sky itself. She's been a thief, a goddess, a queen, an X-Men leader, and the woman who served as the voice of Soul. Yes, today we're dissecting the divine anatomy of Ororo Munroe, the mighty Storm. Here's the thing that always gets me about her. Most heroes have one fixed origin or backstory and spend 60 years living it down. Storm has had about 5, all playing into each other, and every single one of them left a mark on her body and her mind. So this isn't a how many lightning bolts can Storm throw in a day video. This is a proper autopsy of a living goddess, how her senses are connected to the weather, how her grief can flood a city, how losing her powers nearly destroyed her, and how an orphaned mutant from Kenya once defeated Wonder Woman and briefly wielded Thor's hammer. Let's get into it. Is Storm's white hair actually a mutation, and what does her bloodline tell us? Short answer, it surprises a lot of people. Not exactly. The white hair and striking blue eyes are inherited traits passed down through her maternal line rather than expressions of her weather-controlling mutation. Chris Claremont established much of her family history in the Uncanny X-Men number 107, 1976. Ororo's mother, Ndere, was a Kenyan tribal princess, and she came from a centuries-long line of African priestesses, many of whom possessed the same features: white hair, blue eyes, and powerful magical potential. Ndere fell for an American photojournalist called David Monroe, and the two of them settled in New York City, where Ororo was born. Ndere, a princess, was not prepared for the horrific way dark-skinned people were treated in the United States, and she argued to David that they need not tolerate it. When he received a job offer in Cairo, the family moved there and lived there happily for years, until a plane crashed into their house. More on that later. So think about what that means for our anatomy breakdown. Before her mutant powers ever switch on, before she can summon so much as a breeze, Ororo already resembles the ancestral priestess figures of her family. The mystic potential is present from birth, passed down through her matrilineal ancestry. This is important because later, when villagers fall to their knees and call her a goddess, they aren't simply reacting to the powers her mutation gives her. They're reacting to a woman who resembles the sorceress priestess of legend appearing in the flesh. She is a myth come to life for them. Marvel later confirmed that she descends from powerful sorceresses, including Aisha and Ashake. How does Storm's body actually feel the weather? Right, let's get into the nitty-gritty because Storm deserves much more than a surface-level study. We say Storm controls the weather like it's a light switch. It isn't. To control a storm, she first has to perceive and understand the atmospheric forces around her, and Ororo possesses a powerful psionic connection to those forces. Officially, her power is atmokinesis, and she's classed as an Omega-level mutant, meaning the upper limit of her weather manipulation power cannot be meaningfully measured or surpassed within its category. That does not mean she has no physical or psychological limitations, but the mechanism is the interesting part. She's psionically connected to the environment around her. She can sense atmospheric pressure, humidity, temperature gradients, and electrical activity, and her mind interprets all of that as part of the natural system surrounding her. Some stories have shown her perceiving the world as patterns of kinetic, thermal, and electromagnetic energy. So picture her standing on a field. We see grass and sky. Ororo perceives the entire atmospheric system, where the air is unstable, where a front is building, and where electrical energy is gathering before a lightning strike. She's a walking, breathing weather station. But she doesn't just sit there and observe. She can reach into those systems and reshape them according to her will. I should point out that when Storm creates a storm out of a clear blue sky, she generally manipulates the moisture, temperature, pressure, and energy already present in the surrounding environment, rather than simply producing conventional weather from nowhere. She isn't completely abandoning the natural sciences or the laws of physics. She is exerting psionic control over natural forces on an extraordinary scale. And it's worth dwelling on just how alien that sensory experience must be, because it's the part no adaptation ever really conveys. When you walk into a room, you take in the light, the sound, and maybe the temperature, and that's your lot. When Ororo walks into that same room, she may also register the barometric pressure, the moisture hanging in the air, and the electrical and thermal conditions around her. It's an extra channel of information running underneath the ordinary primary 5 senses. Some stories suggest that enclosed or artificial environments can leave her feeling cut off from the open natural systems she is most comfortable sensing. However, her claustrophobia primarily comes from the childhood trauma of being buried beneath the rubble of her home, rather than being caused by the absence of weather. What can Storm actually do beyond lightning and wind? I've seen the general audience talk about Storm a lot, and half of them seem to think she doesn't do much except cause storms. Thank you, Fox X-Men, for that. Lightning Lady massively undersells her. Start with precipitation, rain, snow, sleet, hail, fog, and mist. She summons and dismisses all of it by manipulating atmospheric conditions. Then air, gentle breezes right up through gale force winds, tornadoes, and full hurricanes. Temperature next, she can create localized cold snaps or extreme heat by manipulating environmental temperature. And electricity, of course, from precise surges to massive theatrical bolts. She's even shown fine enough control to freeze objects and people, create whirlwinds pointed in any direction she fancies, and manipulate pollutants or moisture to produce dangerous atmospheric conditions when she wants to be genuinely nasty. But here's where it stops being weather and starts being elemental. She has manipulated the air around or inside a person, altered atmospheric pressure to incapacitate opponents, and used her control over water and electricity in highly inventive ways. She has manipulated moisture and light to obscure herself, and she's not confined to Earth either. In outer space, she has manipulated solar winds, cosmic particles, and the interstellar medium when suitable energy and matter were available. There's one more category worth flagging, and that's the geographical limits or the extraordinary range of her abilities. Storm doesn't always need a big open field to work. She's manipulated atmospheric conditions inside buildings, aboard ships, on space stations, and on alien worlds with atmospheres unlike Earth's. She's created air pressure barriers to shield herself and others. She's launched herself and other people into flight on controlled wind currents, which is how a woman with no conventional power of levitation flies at all. Her control is strong enough to manipulate weather across enormous areas and precise enough to target a single opponent without necessarily affecting everyone around them. Her abilities can operate on both massive and highly localized scales. Storm isn't just a tenacious fighter who can make it rain. She's a climate manipulator who can get stuff done almost anywhere suitable environmental forces exist. Her powers touch ecosystems, agriculture, infrastructure, everything. When she's on your side, she can help end a drought or clear a poisoned sky. When she isn't, she can turn the atmosphere over your head into a weapon before you've noticed the clouds gathering. How do Storm's emotions and trauma change the sky? Now, to tap into a decidedly human section of her anatomy, which rather than being a power, is a vulnerability. Storm's abilities are closely connected to her emotions. Her connection to nature runs so deep that her feelings can influence the weather, sometimes without her consciously intending it. Grief can bring rain. Rage can bring a tempest. And because her powers are second nature, she has to consciously regulate herself to prevent intense emotions from creating dangerous atmospheric reactions. And this is where the childhood trauma plays a big part, because it had such an impact on her while she was growing up and well into adulthood. When Ororo was very young, living in Cairo with her parents, a plane crashed into her home during the Suez Crisis, killing both of her parents and burying her beneath the rubble. She survived it, but it left her with crippling claustrophobia, so severe that she has sometimes curled into a fetal position or become nearly catatonic when trapped. Fear or panic can spike her emotions, and spiking emotions can disrupt her control over the weather, which is exactly why her meditation, discipline, and spiritual calm aren't simply character traits, they are functional necessities. Her emotional regulation is as much a part of her arsenal as weather manipulation is. They are the pressure valves that stop the goddess from leveling a city every time she has a terrible day. This is not to say that she's some emotionless robot who buries everything she feels beneath layers of meditation and control. The link between her heart and the sky means her worst moments can be dangerous, but it also means her environment can sometimes reflect emotions she is trying to conceal. A soft, sorrowful drizzle when she's grieving, a sudden gust when she's angry and pretending she isn't. It's why her composure is such hard-won, deliberate work rather than natural coldness. She isn't necessarily serene by default. She's a deeply feeling person who has trained herself over decades to hold the line because, for her, losing control can become catastrophic. When you understand that, her famous stillness stops looking merely regal and starts looking like enormous constant restraint. She's holding a hurricane behind her teeth and choosing every single day not to let it out. What happens to Storm's body when she loses her powers completely? Yeah, let's get into this. Sorry, Storm, we know it's bad, but we've got to go into life-death. It's a terrible time for her, but it's an extraordinary X-Men classic for a reason. It kicks off in Uncanny X-Men number 185, 1984, when the government agent Henry Gyrick fires a mutant power neutralizer created by Forge. It was meant for Rogue. Storm shoved her teammate clear and took the full blast herself, and just like that, her mutation was gone. Her powers were stripped away with no immediate sign they can be restored. The follow-up, Uncanny X-Men number 186, is the life-death issue proper, a quiet, gorgeous double-sized story by Claremont and Barry Windsor Smith. And the way she describes the loss is the key to understanding her whole biology. She doesn't simply say she's weaker. She says she can no longer feel her connection to nature, and that without it she is merely existing, a shadow of what she was. She stops eating. She stops moving. Losing her powers isn't like losing a weapon. For her, it was like going suddenly deaf to a world she had sensed throughout most of her life. Because for Storm, weather sense had become as fundamental as any ordinary sense. She had lost an essential part of herself, and she was grieving. After leaving the X-Mansion, Ororo is taken in by the mutant inventor Forge. As they spend time together, they start to fall for one another, and then, in the cruelest twist, she overhears a conversation and learns that Forge built the very weapon that depowered her. What makes that confrontation land so hard, and why the issue is remembered as a genuine classic rather than just another power loss plot, is the cruelty of the specific betrayal. It isn't only that someone she likes built the weapon, it's that he's a mutant himself, one of her own kind, who invented the very tool the government used to strip a mutant of an essential part of herself. To Ororo, it's a betrayal of their people, and she tells him exactly that in no unclear terms. The art does a lot of the heavy lifting, too. Windsor Smith's quieter, more spacious pages give the grief room to breathe in a way the usual wall-to-wall superhero action never would. There are fewer captions, fewer word balloons, more silence, and that silence is the point. This is a woman who has gone quiet in every sense, cut off from the roar of the weather she used to live inside. The comic makes you feel the absence, not just be told about it. Anyway, so she decks him, "You go, girl," and walks out into a rainstorm she can no longer command. But she is still Storm, even without her powers. In Life Death 2, Uncanny X-Men number 198, 1985, she returns to Africa. She lives as an ordinary human, helps safely deliver a baby, and manages to find something akin to peace, even in her grief and isolation. Her body can't fly, she says, but in her heart she soars higher than the star. Her powers wouldn't actually return until Uncanny X-Men number 226, 1988. When Forge used technology based on his neutralizer to restore them. But the period in between proves the thesis of this entire video, and the reason this moment reverberates so far through her later stories is that it establishes the single most important rule of the character. Storm's authority was never borrowed from her mutation. It's hers. When the Omega level classification came along years later and placed a label on her power ceiling, it was almost redundant for anyone who had read this issue, because we already watched her win the most important fight of her life with no special abilities at all, except her own grit and will. That's the well she keeps drawing from on Arakko, a society that respects strength above all else, where she repeatedly faces challenges and wins through nerve, strategy, and sheer refusal to yield. Her strength of will is unparalleled. The weather is her loudest instrument, but her duel with Cyclops proved decades in advance that if you took every last watt of it away, the most dangerous thing in the room would still be Ororo Munroe's will. Take away the mutation and Storm is still Storm. How did a powerless Storm beat Cyclops for leadership of the X-Men? And to prove that point in the most dramatic way imaginable, we come to Uncanny X-Men number 201, 1986, the famous duel between the X-Men leaders. The setup is actually really funny because Xavier is away and Magneto has been installed as headmaster. Magneto, of all people. Surely that will go down well, right? Sometimes I don't understand Xavier's decisions, I swear. Anyway, Cyclops, now a father, wants to reclaim leadership of the team. Storm, though she has returned home, is still completely powerless at this point and challenges him for it in the danger room. Just think of the mismatch for a second. Cyclops has his optic blasts. Storm has nothing. No wind, no lightning, no flight. Just the skills of a woman who was once one of the best pickpockets and street thieves in Cairo, along with years of X-Men training. She agrees to a duel against a man who can fire concussive forces from his eyes, and she wins using cover, timing, patience, and a decisive move that removes his visor and leaves him unable to continue safely. Yes, there's a later wrinkle where it's revealed that Madeline Pryor psychically influenced Cyclops and affected his performance. But the image that stuck, the one that defined her for a generation of readers and continues to, is Ororo Munroe with zero powers, proving that she could still be an exceptional leader through sheer nerve and skill. Cyclops has continued to respect her as one of the X-Men's greatest leaders. What does it actually mean that Storm was worshipped as a goddess? After the plane crash and before the X-Men ever found her, Ororo eventually traveled into the Serengeti as a young woman. This was when her powers surfaced and local communities began to venerate her as a rain goddess for easing droughts and protecting the land. Now, we usually treat this as an interesting bit of backstory. It makes her seem more mystical, more powerful, and certainly more intimidating. But think about the job description, because it essentially is a job, just not the one you can get from LinkedIn. These circumstances modify her entire skill set. A superhero uses weather as a weapon in bursts during a crisis, then flies home and rests until the call comes again. A rain goddess uses it as everyday infrastructure. She has to think about the timing and intensity of the rains, about soil health, about crop cycles, and about not flooding the very fields she's trying to save. She's responsible for maintaining an ecosystem because harvests, people, and lives depend on her getting the balance exactly right. There's a completely different use of the anatomy we've been describing. The battlefield version of Storm is a tactical strike. The goddess version is a caretaker of the land, running the climate like an engine and living with the consequences. Under the guidance of an elder and foster mother named Inet, she learned to wield her gift responsibly. This is why, even in the most violent fights, she's reluctant to cut completely loose. She has spent her life knowing that thoughtless use of her powers can harm innocent lives. And there is a psychological cost buried in the goddess role that I want to get into because it becomes crucial to her later arcs. Being worshipped is not the same as being loved, and it's certainly not the same as being known. The villagers didn't necessarily see Ororo as the frightened orphan girl from Cairo who couldn't sleep in a small enclosed room. They saw a divine figure who brought the rains. That gap between the goddess people bow to and the human being underneath is a thread Marvel Comics has been pulling on for decades. It's there in her discomfort with being placed above others, and in her insistence much later that Arakko needed something greater than a queen. So the goddess era is much more than exotic backstory. It's the origin of a lifelong tension, the pull between the reverence her power inspires and the real woman who has to carry all that reverence around. She learned very young that people would kneel to her and her power. Learning to let them see her as a flesh and blood person took a great deal longer. How did Storm beat Wonder Woman in DC vs. Marvel? Right, the big one. The fight comic book spaces still argue about, though there's actually no shortage of things they argue about. In 1996, DC and Marvel did the unthinkable and smashed their universes together in DC vs. Marvel, a crossover where the outcomes of several marquee fights were decided by fan votes. And one of the most anticipated matches staged in number 3 was Storm against Wonder Woman, the African goddess versus the Amazon warrior. Okay, before getting into the actual fight, I need you to remember that during this crossover, Wonder Woman proved herself worthy and lifted Thor's hammer. She could have fought Storm while wielding Mjolnir, but Diana, being Diana, tossed it aside so the duel would be fair. And Storm, being Storm, did exactly what a smart weather manipulator does against a far stronger, close-range warrior. She kept her distance and, after a brief exchange, struck Diana repeatedly with lightning until she dropped. The writers framed it as a hard-fought defeat rather than a humiliation, and neither character was treated as dishonorable. And yes, before the comments section explodes, it was a fan vote, and the enormous 90s popularity of the X-Men absolutely influenced it. But look at how the story justified it. It's a strong demonstration of Storm's combat strategy. She can read atmospheric conditions, time her strikes, and remain airborne while preventing a more physically powerful opponent from closing the distance. She didn't beat Wonder Woman by being stronger. She beat her by controlling the battlefield and refusing to fight the fight Diana wanted. Elemental mastery plus battlefield intelligence. That's the whole Storm package in 2 phrases. Fan vote or not, the published story presents Storm as the winner. It's also worth being honest about the afterlife of that result. Years later, Gail Simone conducted an informal online fan poll that matched Storm and Wonder Woman again, and Wonder Woman won that vote. But it was not a canonical rematch or a published continuation of DC vs. Marvel. It mainly demonstrated how popularity and fan sentiment change over time. When it comes to fights like these, people need to remember that power scaling depends on writers, circumstances, and sometimes fan votes. The '96 result was a snapshot of the X-Men's enormous popularity at their peak. But the story built around that vote, the noble rejection of the hammer and the weather goddess controlling the battlefield, still stands on its own terms. However, the fans voted, and the in-story method Storm used, distance, patience, and repeated lightning, is textbook Ororo. Is Storm actually worthy of Mjolnir? Speaking of that iconic hammer, is Ororo herself worthy of it? The answer is not as definitively established as fans sometimes claim. It starts as a con. During the Asgardian Wars, the trickster god Loki, drawing on Storm's misery at being powerless, enchanted her and handed her Stormcaster, a hammer modeled on Mjolnir, in X-Men Annual No. 9, 1985. It made her the goddess of thunder, but it was a manipulation created by Loki, not a genuine test of worthiness. She rejected his offer once she saw through him. The next important moment comes in X-Men To Serve and Protect No. 3. Thor brings the returned Stormcaster to Wakanda. Storm touches it and falls back under Loki's enchantment, and to free herself, she takes Thor's hand, and they use Mjolnir together to smash the tainted hammer to pieces. They were both holding it, so this does not conclusively establish that she independently passed Odin's traditional worthiness enchantment. Then, in the Immortal Thor No. 4, Thor called Storm to help fight the elder god Turanos. He shared Mjolnir and its power with Storm and the other members of a temporary Thor Corps. Ororo briefly held Mjolnir, which restored her Asgardian powers for 1 minute. It is a major endorsement from Thor and shows that the hammer could be entrusted to her under those circumstances, but the story presents the power as something Thor deliberately shared among his allies rather than as a separate, definitive worthiness trial. So Storm has wielded Mjolnir, but whether she can always lift it independently under Odin's classic enchantment remains open to interpretation. What does Omega Level Weather Manipulator really mean? Omega Level gets thrown around a lot, often with no proper explanation, so let's define it properly. The Omega Level classification, formalized during the Hickman-era House of X relaunch, marks a mutant whose dominant power in one specific category has no definable upper limit. Storm is on that list for weather manipulation, and translated into this specific exploration of anatomy, it means her potential control over atmospheric systems cannot be meaningfully surpassed within that power category. Think about it. To hold a hurricane in place takes continuous focus. To manipulate lightning, pressure systems, winds, and temperature on enormous scales requires concentration and control. There are stories in which drawing too much atmospheric energy through herself causes Storm pain or overwhelms her control. She also possesses considerable resistance to weather effects and electrical energy, but she is not universally immune to all electricity or energy attacks. There is a darker truth to the meaning of Omega. It does not mean Storm has infinite stamina, perfect control, or no weaknesses. The danger is that the potential scale of her power is extraordinary. An Omega-level weather manipulator losing control could trigger a catastrophic climate event, which brings us right back to those internal safety systems, because without her discipline and restraint, her abilities could endanger countless lives. How did being Queen of Wakanda and Regent of Arakko change how Storm used her powers? For a while, Ororo was the Queen of Wakanda, married to King T'Challa, the Black Panther. This is markedly different from being a superhero or a local goddess. Being part of a monarchy means she can't simply zap every problem away. Every use of her powers can become a matter of state, wrapped in diplomacy and consequence. Then the Krakoan era took it interstellar. After mutant kind terraformed Mars, with Storm helping create and stabilize its atmosphere and weather, it was renamed Arakko. Can you imagine being powerful enough to help stabilize an entire planet's atmosphere? It's freaking insane. Ororo won the position of Regent of Arakko by defeating Nameless and becoming the voice of Sol, the solar system's official representative in galactic affairs. Arakko was declared the capital of the solar system, making Storm one of its most important political representatives, not its sole ruler. The tension that makes it interesting is that Arakko is a society forged by war that respects strength. So when the gene manipulator Taran the Uncaring challenged her and stripped her mutant powers away, she still defeated him and forced him to yield, sending a message the Arakki would understand. Her powers had become political acts on a scale much greater than during her tenure as Queen of Wakanda. The empathic goddess who craves balance, and the regent who sometimes has to make a terrifying show of force for the greater good. And notably, even while holding that authority, she destroyed the throne and declared that Arakko needed something greater than a queen. The burden of it genuinely cost her, which is what keeps this arc from feeling like a power fantasy. Holding political, diplomatic, and military responsibilities meant being pulled in a dozen directions at once, and Marvel hasn't shied away from showing the toll. She was forced into a contest by Otherworld's Saturnine and stole Wakanda's sacred Skybreaker sword, an act that strained her bond with the nation she once ruled as queen. She held Magneto in her arms as he died defending Arakko, and later took his seat of loss on the Great Ring. She fought a civil war against Genesis over the future of the planet. She wasn't lounging around on a throne enjoying her promotion. Instead, she kept getting handed impossible situations and paying for the solutions out of her own skin. Every escalation in her status came bolted to an escalation in what she stood to lose, and she was never allowed to forget it. How do Storm's morals and leadership reflect her elemental powers? You've probably noticed a theme by now, and it's the essential fact of her whole anatomy. Her personality mirrors her power. Storm is calm, composed, and rarely reckless. She's a brilliant tactician, capable of understanding complex scientific and environmental problems, and enough of a natural leader to stand alongside Cyclops as one of the greatest leaders the X-Men have ever had. But her defining ethical instinct is proportion. She prefers precise, measured uses of power, mercy, and negotiation before overwhelming force, mirroring the way natural balance works rather than the way chaos does. She knows better than anyone that a stray gust or a mistimed bolt can kill people who did nothing wrong, because her power operates on a scale where mistakes are measured in lives. So when Storm does finally go all out, it lands with such weight precisely because it's rarely a tantrum. It's a decision she has weighed and chosen. Her morality is the governor on the engine. She is a global scale power source, and she has deliberately built a strong conscience around it as a failsafe. How do cartoons and films show Storm's divine anatomy differently? Quick compare and contrast to finish the dissection, because the adaptations tell very different stories about Ororo Munroe. Animated Storm often understands who Ororo is. The 90s X-Men series and more recently X-Men 97 lean hard into the weather goddess. Regal posture, sweeping speeches, commanding the elements out loud, huge dramatic storms, and crucially, her role as a tactical leader. X-Men 97 even adapted the life-death storyline, depowering her and bringing in Forge, which was a bold thing to put in the first season of a revival. The Fox X-Men films gave us the basics: lightning, wind, flight, and glowing white eyes. The original films didn't get deeply into her backstory, while X-Men Apocalypse showed part of her life as a street thief and depicted Apocalypse altering her hair color instead of presenting it as an inherited family trait. These movies consistently reduced her to a supporting player with far less authority, and Storm there is nowhere near her actual comic book scale. You'd never guess from those movies that this is a woman who helped terraform a planet and represented the solar system in galactic affairs. So if you've only met Storm on the big screen, you've met maybe a tenth of her, and that's me being generous. There is so much: the priestess bloodline, the goddess years, the Omega classification, the leadership arcs, and the Asgardian connections that lives almost entirely in the comics. Not that it's all doom and gloom on the adaptation side. The encouraging sign is how much recent animation has course corrected. X-Men 97 adapted Life Death, one of her most internal and least action-driven stories, and trusted a modern audience to sit with a hero grieving the loss of her powers and identity. That's a real statement of faith in the character as more than a walking special effect. And with Storm's comic profile higher than it has arguably ever been, The gap between the definitive comic book Ororo and the version most casual fans know is finally starting to close. Hopefully, Marvel Studios' eventual live-action X-Men reboot will do Storm justice. It's about time. So let's put her back together on the table. Storm looks at a glance like the typical kind of hero. Flowing white hair, dramatic cape, calls down the lightning with a speech. But underneath, she's one of the most complex characters in all of Marvel. A mutant consciousness intrinsically connected to the atmosphere. Emotions that can flood a valley or a city if she lets them slip. A bloodline of priestesses running through her before her mutation ever activated. And a mind so disciplined that it can help keep an entire ecosystem, and for a time the politics of an entire solar system, in balance. She's been a thief, a goddess, a queen, an omega-level mutant, the regent of Arakko, the voice of Soul, and a woman who has briefly wielded a god's hammer. And she's carried every one of those roles on the same set of shoulders with absolute poise and strength of character. So here's my question to leave you with. What's more divine, the power that lets her rewrite the sky, or the restraint that stops her from doing it every time she's angry? Let me know down in the comments, smash that like and subscribe, and tell me whose anatomy you want on the slab next. See you in the next one!